Dr. Chin, thank you for the invite, and thank you for also presenting to our own work group, which I'll talk a little bit about in this presentation. I'm not sure exactly how you guys have all of this set up, but considering your graduate seminar, my goal really is to offer you insights into our work and really offer some lessons learned of how we accomplish a lot of the work that we do. So even though I'm presenting, I hope this is an open discussion. And if you at any moment have questions, please feel free to just chime in and interrupt and ask these questions so that we can have a flow that's very open and that you guys can really learn as much from. And I also hope to learn from you here in this conversation. So Dr. Chin shared a little bit of my background. Ironically, the reason I got into environmental science was because I was in environmental engineering. And I remember thinking, I don't want to diverge wetlands, I want to save them. And here we are. Now I'm talking to engineering students, but I'm super passionate about everything that we do at the district. I'm a native South Floridian. And my role at the district as coordinator is pretty broad. I do everything from stakeholder engagement, both internal, meaning in the district, external at the sometimes federal, state, and local level. And then my main task, which is probably what I'll be the most versed in this presentation, because I will try to give you a very wide breadth of what it is that we do in resiliency, and that has a lot of moving parts. But my focus is on what we call our water and climate resilience metrics. And these are essentially indicators of how our system responds, of the influencing factors that are acting upon our system, and how we advance these metrics. So I work closely with our technical leads, and I'll share more about that as well, to kind of advance those efforts. Great, so during this presentation, I will offer you a background of the district, historically, how the district came to be, what role it plays in South Florida, what our mission is. Then I'll talk to you about our resiliency initiatives. These are district-wide initiatives. They're not just out of any one office, and they're initiatives that we are coordinating at the state and local and federal level. I'll talk about how we monitor resilience. And so that's through our metrics. There was supposed to be another bullet there where it says Resilience Metrics Hub. I'll share with you our hub where a lot of the information that I'm sharing with you today is available. I'll talk to you about data integration. And when I talk about this, I won't just be focusing on, how we're bringing data from different places, but even how we're leveraging the technical expertise that oftentimes is embedded within the talent at any agency. And it's kind of this empirical knowledge that's hard to replace, but it's so valuable when folks get together to really achieve some resiliency goals or any goals in any field. Then I'll talk about how we apply all of this data and all of these initiatives, and share a little bit about what it is we really have learned through all of this process, what I have learned, what I'm still learning, and what we're looking to in the future in terms of resiliency for the region as a water management agency. And of course, maybe I should get to my next slide, our mission. For us as the district, our goals are very clear, and our activities are completely entrenched into these specific goals. And so those are to protect our communities from flooding everywhere, inland and at the coast, to ensure that our water supplies are protected, again, everywhere, inland and at the coast, and to restore our ecosystem so that they can really sustain our water management system, but also our natural environments that we really rely on for a variety of services. All right, before I go into discussing kind of our present day activities, I want to share a little bit about our background so that you can really get the full picture of how we arrive at the needs of today, and also how we, where we know we need improvements, and how we got here. So the water management, or really the drainage system that we call the Central and Southern Florida water management system, at the time known as the project, really started back in the 1920s. So this is when development was first initiated and approved through Congress. And the real goals of this work was drainage, so to drain a lot of our wetlands, and specifically for the purpose of agriculture. You'll see as we kind of continue this conversation how that has changed, and being that you're in Miami, you know that how much the environment and the landscape has changed since then. So when we look at just a map of a drainage system in Florida, here in this pre-1948 drainage projects, we can see all the change. So in the 1920s, all of this got initiated. By the late 40s, we were really, draining, dredging, and placing canals. And then here we are today in the later part of the century. Well, now in a new millennia, but with, as you can see, a highly intricate system, a highly managed system, and also now a heavily populated system. So what we saw in the decades since then is we moved from this highly agriculturally focused land, the original purpose for draining the land, to this highly populous, more urban land. And so that's really where we have some of the challenges today that we're facing. I'm sure everyone knows, they talk politically, that you hear talk of people are moving here, and our population is growing, and we have these numbers, and we also have projections on what that might look like in the future. So in 2020, it was 8.7. Today, we're at 9.1. So it just keeps going up. Okay, if we look at our water management system today, I'll share first a little bit about the district itself, and then talk a little bit about how we kind of, I don't want to say classify, but how the system works with these different parts. So the district is one of 5 districts in Florida. We're at the southern end of the peninsula, from Orlando down to the Florida Keys, and we cover both the East Coast and the West Coast of South Florida. Again, the water management system is known as the CNSF, or the Central and Southern Florida Water Management System. Again, we're the most populated and also the largest and the most heavily managed district in Florida. If you look at like South Florida versus the Northwest Florida district, even the things that we consider to be our infrastructure, our assets, completely outnumber those of any of the other districts. We have over 2,200 miles of canals and embankments. We have structures along the coast to keep salt water at bay and move floodwaters out to the ocean. And so the system itself exists kind of within this tiered system that is interconnected. And so this kind of moves through what we call the primary, which are like the canals that are those of the district, those that are federal waterways, so usually of the Corps, who we coordinate with heavily. And then we have the secondary system, which is when you think about like your county canals, your county structures, and then the tertiary system, which is at the neighborhood level. If we all have, a pond, and I know I have a pond in front of my house, what we call colloquially here in South Florida, a borrow pit. That's a form of drainage, right? A form of retaining and storing water, flood waters when they come in, within our neighborhoods. And so all of these things really do work together. They might have a purpose like control floodwater, but also that means water storage and recharge to our aquifers. And we can talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, so in terms of our initiatives, the district monitors a lot of data. That's kind of what we're known for. It's like our longstanding tradition. We're the scientific data people in the region. And we do this along with, other entities. We do this along with our counties, with the state, other regional folks, especially at the USGS. And so when we were considering, okay, how do we advance our initiatives to make a more resilient system, we first said, okay, we have to look at our data. What do we have and what does it tell us? I'm also going to interrupt myself because I just realized I'm talking about resiliency without kind of saying what resiliency is. I can't see anyone on the screen, but does anyone want to tell us or share what they think resiliency is?
Resistance to like damage and harsh change.
Yeah, that's a part of it. That's right. That's actually correct. So it's the ability to withstand, you know, like you said, challenges and changes, and specifically like pulse events that we don't usually experience on a day-to-day basis. And then the second part to that is withstand them, but not withstand them in a way that we are, you know, kind of keeping our fingers crossed that our structures don't fall apart, or that, you know, people don't experience flooding. Also withstand them in a way that is like, oh, you did, the system did that gracefully. The system was able to bounce back, continue to operate, and continue to deliver a service without needing, you know, an immense amount of intervention. So some of the reasons for this that I talk about, you know, not just withstand it, but then also the ability to recover in a graceful way, is because a lot of the things about climate change are still uncertain. I think we all know, yes, the temperatures of the sea surface, for example, have gone up, or we're experiencing more extreme events, not just in South Florida, all over the world. We heard it in the news, what's happening in Missouri. We saw a couple of years ago what's happening in California. But we also know that some things are uncertain. We don't have, you know, a handbook for exactly how change is going to look, when pulse events are going to occur. We've seen with storms that have hit other areas in the Gulf and even in the Northeast with Sandy, that it doesn't, it's, you know, it's kind of like everyone's holding their breath. So we are still highly uncertain. But with that being said, there are ways that we can prepare our system and our knowledge base to really respond to these events. And so what the district realized by looking at all of our data is, you know, there is a need to really quantify resilience. And I'll kind of go over our metrics, but, you know, truly the quantification is what will tell us what's acting on the system. And again, how is the system responding? So the goal of our metrics is, one, to track the measurable and observed data available to us. Two, to document this. And three, I guess, isn't really written here, but it's to identify when there is a change, identify when there is a shift. And I'll share a little bit about this in my coming slides. So together, all of these efforts, what they do is they are part of all of the activities that help us to support our mission, provide flood protection, provide water supply well into the future, and also help restore our systems. And again, when we talk about resiliency, it's not just in the future, it's also now. It's being able to, under current conditions and past conditions, and future conditions, based on the data we have available from the past, be able to withstand events. Does anybody have questions so far before I keep just rambling on? Okay, so our metrics, what are they? Again, I mentioned, you know, there are ways to quantify how the system is acted upon and how the system is responding. So we have our metrics divided into what we call our climate metrics. And so these are those influencing factors, the drivers of change. And so these are climatic conditions that, even though we know as humans we have a impact on these, you know, we know we've made the earth warmer or the atmosphere warmer, we know, you know, we've changed land, etc. We don't directly really influence these things. We can't control these things. We can't control rain or evapotranspiration or sea level. And so those metrics are, like I just said, rainfall, evapotranspiration, tidal elevation, saltwater intrusion. I'll share a little bit about this in a coming slide, but we look at saltwater intrusion in two different ways, which is pretty neat. So that includes our groundwater levels, and then we look at minimum flows and water levels. What that is, it's kind of a mouthful, but what it essentially means is like, what's the minimum amount of water required to really maintain the functioning of the system? Similar to like, we need 64 ounces of water a day. except the region needs a lot more. And then we look at flooding events. Flooding events are actually exactly a count of how often are we experiencing flooding events, but also additionally, what is the extent of flooding? What is the duration? How long is flooding occurring for? I think when we talk about extent, we also think, depth of flooding, for example. And then we have our resilience metrics. And so these are the ones that are the respond variables. So these are the observed consequences of the changing climate metrics or the climate conditions. And so this is where we can kind of say, okay, well, we saw, an increase in, let's say, rainfall. So how are we seeing the system respond? One really fast indicator are always the surface water quality metrics. So we have water quality that looks at temperature, dissolved oxygen, specific conductance, and pH. And this is more in our system. So within our man-made canals and our natural waterways. But then we're also looking at it from the ecological perspective, which is more my background and my forte. When we look at salinity in our bays, we know that there's an issue with, is there enough water flowing into the bay? How's that impacting salinity, which in turn goes on to impact ecological interactions, the establishment of historically saline plants and fauna in the water column itself. And then of course we have soil subsidence and the inland migration of estuarine plant species. Any questions on this?
Wait, did you say the estuary inland migration includes like species and like animals and stuff? Did I hear that right?
Yes, yeah, that's correct. So what we do is we know that with the initial drainage of the South Florida Peninsula, we changed the way water flows. And what we saw then was a die-off of certain freshwater species, because that allows salt water to kind of come into areas that were historically freshwater marsh, as opposed to your coastal saline marshes. So one thing that we monitor is the migration of mangroves. I don't have it on this slide, but I'd be happy to share with you all. And we have a report coming out on this early next year, some imagery of how much the extent of migration that we've seen of mangroves moving inland. Because, mangroves are not obligate, what we call like facultative saltwater species. They just are able to outcompete the freshwater species. But when this kind of goes into a lot of different interactions that we talk about, like soil subsidence, the way soil is built, mangroves play a key role in that. And so their propagules require a certain level of soil, a certain elevation of soil to be present for them to become established. So we do know that if we're, not maintaining, for example, from our climate metrics, our minimum flows and water levels into the bays, then we also know that's having a responsive impact downstream to the ecology of our system.
Okay.
And so it's interesting, we can talk about all of these things kind of by themselves, but they are all interconnected. That was a really good question. Okay, so I talk a lot about the resilience initiatives, right? But everyone's like, okay, well, thanks for the information, but how do I find that? Where do I see it? So the way that we are communicating all of these scientific findings are, this is all very highly technical information. And so one way that we communicate this is through reporting. We have, for example, the first image of this report here that says Water and Climate Resilience Metrics, that's a report that outlines how we arrived at these metrics. In doing this, it was a large work group. We had considerations for, well, to identify a trend, do we have sufficient data? Are there data gaps? Is it good quality data? I think anyone who works, all of us work with data in some way, but anyone who works looking at especially environmental data, it gets hairy very fast. So this kind of got us, this report talks about the process of how we arrived at our metrics. Then annually, as of last year, we inaugurated a chapter in the report where in the South Florida Environmental Report, which is a mandated report that goes out to the state every year, to kind of give an update on the state of the system. It's part of our reporting requirements, oftentimes part of our permitting requirements. And this report, what it does is it kind of, what's the word? It takes what we have in the initial phase 1 report where we looked at initial trends, and it kind of upgrades them. It brings in the latest data. It starts to look at, okay, we only chose what the metrics were, but what are the influencing factors? You know, so for example, when I say influencing factors, I mean, you look at rainfall. Okay, one influencing factor is, you know, oscillations in the ocean and the environment. So what are the roles of La Nina and El Nino? So that's what we mean by influencing factors. And influencing factors can be both, you know, anthropogenic things and natural phenomena. And then we also have technical memorandums. You know, the latest technical memorandum was one where and I'll share this a little bit more in a moment, where we looked at how rainfall is changing in the future to conduct flood vulnerability assessments. And that's a whole thing in itself, because when you look at rainfall, I'm sure you've talked about this with Dr. Chin, you know, we're not looking at, annual rainfall and how that might change in the future. We're looking at pulse events and how they might impact a basin or a watershed. So that's the first way, the more technical way that we communicate a lot of our findings. And then the second way is we have a metrics hub. It's hosted on our GIS services. So those are hosted by Esri. And this hub has everything from automated tools that I'll share with you to kind of like, what's the word? More simple language, so that if someone visits this website, they can really read it and be like, okay, I understand, I get the foundational aspects of this. And then it also shares a lot of the technical information that's in these reports as well. So for us, resiliency initiatives aren't just something that's happening in-house. They're also things that we're coordinating with a lot of stakeholders and other agencies, and communicating and sharing information, and really trying to put out there so that it is useful planning tools for our constituents. We oversee 16 different counties. Counties don't often have the same resources that we have as a water management district. So our big picture goal is also to, if we really want to achieve resiliency for the region, then we need to also support the smaller scale areas in the counties and the municipalities and the smaller cities, and the more rural areas, as well as the heavily populated coastal cities that are trying to also, you know, start up on these initiatives. The Lower East Coast, Miami-Dade, Broward, West Palm Beach, they are well advanced. They have established resiliency offices. They've been doing similar studies. And so we're coordinating with them closely so that if we're going to achieve resiliency at the regional level, their support and our support, and it goes both ways, is present and available. So I think this slide was probably the more appropriate one too, to talk about what I was just saying about how we communicate, public engagement. So really having all of these tools together, our reports, our metrics hub, our story maps, our automated data analysis tools, what this does ultimately is make things easier to understand, make them easy to find and access online, make data that's readily available. I'll talk a little bit more about where data comes from in the district, but the bottom line is sometimes it's hard to find. And so here we kind of house together all of the things that are more specifically related to resiliency. Of course, this involves, you know, interactive features and visual aids. So if you go to our metrics hub, this is the link. I can share that with Dr. Shin for him to share with you later or after this meeting. But essentially our hub it's kind of just this one place where we are bringing together relevant resources. We're bringing together the information that we have. We're bringing together tools. So our story maps, the first place that you see is what we call the emerging trends in regional resiliency. This is where we look at some of our metrics. We are still in the process of bringing more to this platform. We look at some of our metrics and we provide what are the trends that we have identified. And we also provide context for that because, for example, someone might see, oh, an upward trend sounds really positive. But if we're talking about salinity in the Everglades, that's not a positive trend. It's a positive trend statistically and significantly positive, but that's not necessarily good for that environment where we don't want the intrusion of salt water into historically fresh ecosystems. So we offer just kind of that more like plain language and that interpretation of the data. We have a section now called Future Outlook and Regional Resiliency. This is where we're bringing projections, tools to look at current conditions in the future that also inform resiliency planning. And so this can be, you know, at the most basic level, I think rainfall is a really kind of complex topic. But at the most basic level, the one that we all hear is, you know, NOAA just put out the 2022 sea level rise projections. And so that's at the most basic level, like the kind of data that we need to inform what our system might look like or what our system is up against in the future to make more informed planning. Then we have a few links that are really where all of the information that is put in these first two items is coming from. And so that's our data from the district. This includes our hydrogeological monitoring database, as well as our GIS services, our annual report that we put out. We offer information about our local agencies and municipalities in the state. A lot of the work that they're doing is really building resiliency at the community level. And then we have our national and regional data sources. And what they're doing, since they're not at the community level, is really providing the information that we need to inform us on and understand how our climate is changing into the future. So I'll share a little bit about our automated data analysis that I briefly mentioned. And I just want to say where this information comes from. I have the first bullet here before I even get into the data. I cannot stress this enough, that everything is also informed by a, phenomenal group of people at the district, including people from our modeling groups, which is hydrology and hydraulics, our water supply group, who work a lot with municipalities and also do a lot of the water use permitting, our folks in applied sciences that look at water quality, our data managers, we have IT, geospatial, and just so many other people who really are able to provide that like empirical knowledge that you don't have just from mining data out of a database. The thing that we always go by is we don't want to be data rich and information poor. We want to have data that informs and is shareable and is easy to understand and gets us to the next level of planning. And then we have data that is just actually the raw and plain data that comes out of our databases. The first one is DB Hydro. This is our, like I said, hydrometeorological database. It includes water quality data, water level data, and all of our district-owned structures and infrastructure and canals and all of our kind of real estate assets. And this is data that we manage. So we have our field staff collecting this data. We have that data in-house. It goes through a QAQC process, and then it's shared and it's available publicly. It is so much data that if you go into DB Hydro and you're just looking, for example, like for our resiliency metrics, it's hard to know where to start. And so that's where the metrics hub comes in and helps. And then we have data that comes from our e-permitting database. This database is really meant for kind of like the business processing of the regulated community. However, it's also where they submit their compliance and monitoring reporting. So the assumption is that they've already QAQC'd their data. They've already, removed outliers, interpolated data gaps, or removed data that's, not qualified, that's been qualified. And so here we have a little less control over the kind of quality of the data. So we're very careful about what we bring in, and I'll share a little bit about that in the coming slides. So the first automated data analysis that we have is the tidal elevations at our coastal structures. I guess you guys are down at maybe some of the closer structures are down in, there's there's a canal down in South Miami and much more south of that. This S29 is located not too far. But essentially what we're looking at is this. A lot of our infrastructure is designed to have kind of, as you guys are engineers, they have a design capacity. And so when we have these, heavy, for example, heavy flooding, inland, we need to move water out. Well, we really rely on sufficient hydrological gradient to move water out because a lot of these are gravity structures. The gates open automatically when it hits a certain range and it allows water to flow out. Our challenge today is that sea levels are rising, and we've seen this that it's not only have they risen over the last 100 years, but that rising is accelerating over the last 20. You can look at long-term data for 100 years and see maybe 3 millimeters per year of sea level rise, but you look at just the last 20 years and we're seeing, 5 to 7, depending on the station. So that says a lot. That says that this is accelerating. And what that's going to do is pose a challenge, and it already has posed a challenge during certain events, such as king tides, for our systems to really operate in the way that they do and should operate. And again, these systems were put in place, as I shared with the background, decades ago. They're still retrofitted to the situation back then, not the population today, not the amount of water today, not the lack of sometimes land for storage of water. And so this table here at the bottom right of the screen is really kind of a graphic visualization tool to show how the capacity of our structures decreases as the tidal elevations increase. We call those tailwater. And then we call the fresh water coming in from inland headwater. So on the metrics hub, as I mentioned, we have kind of this background of like, where's this data coming from? Why is this really relevant? And then we offer this map where you can click on any of the structures and you're automatically given, and then you click on the little link that DB Hydro's insights water levels, and you're automatically given all of the data, and you're given the daily mean, from which we ourselves calculate the annual mean. And it is based on that annual mean that we then run a trend analysis to see what the trend is at this structure. So this is S29. It has increased because what we do is a Mantendo. We have p-values that tell us, the statistical significance of these, and that's all available online. In addition to that, you can download the data that was used already KQC to produce all of this specific kind of analysis. Any questions?
It's hard to read, but what is the y-axis on that graph? The water level?
So, oh, sure. That's the actual water level and NGVD 29 in feet.
Ah, okay.
Mm-hmm. And, I have so much to share in this one presentation. I can just go on about this all day, but I mean, when we look at those light blue, you can see our daily means just going up and down with our tide. You can see when we had storm surge events or sunny day flooding. This is really telling. So the y-axis is the actual elevation, the water level in feet, and then the bottom axis is just time. So I will note that if you go into any of these, you'll see that our period of record kind of changes depending on when the structure was put in place, when measuring implements were deployed, etc. Okay, so the other metric that we have automated in the hub already is the saltwater, two of our saltwater intrusion metrics. I think a lot can be said about saltwater intrusion. I'm going to keep it very basic, and what we tend to really share immediately is, the immediate threat for us is saltwater is going to push, not only come inland toward us, but then also it's going to push up our water table. So that's what this diagram at the bottom right is showing. The top left diagram is kind of a diagram of cross sections within our well fields that's available online. That's a little more technical and intrinsic, so please go view that whenever you have time. But the main message we want to deliver here is, if we have a lot of superficial aquifers in South Florida. That means aquifers that are unconfined, that are right at the surface, that are highly susceptible to pollution, of course, because they're open ground. And then also they're susceptible to these interactions, the osmotic interactions between freshwater and saltwater. And so we expect that as that sea levels rise, our interface will move inland and impact our water tables. And this kind of becomes a bigger picture, but it also kind of impedes our ability to move water out and increases our chances of flooding. If we have a higher water table already, and then we experience let's say an extreme rainfall event, that water has nowhere to go. It won't percolate into the ground. And so what we look at now, our lead modeler in resiliency, he gets kind of focused on looking at what we call compound flooding impacts. And so that's when we have, okay, we don't have enough space in the ground to store water. The water table is higher because it's been pushed up because we've had antecedent rain conditions that were really high, or it's been pushed up by salt water at the coast. And now we have a rainfall event and we can't really convey this water out to sea. And so now our flooding impacts are compounded by various phenomena that are happening. So when we look at some of our metrics, and the two that I can think of right now specifically are saltwater intrusion and the mangrove migration that we were talking about, we can actually look at these a little bit differently, which is really helpful for visualization. So instead of doing a statistical trend analysis, what we can do is a spatial trend analysis. So if you go into the hub today and you look at the data available for saltwater intrusion, you can see lines of where the saltwater interface has been over time. The district evaluates the saltwater interface every 5 years. So we have lines every 5 years for each of our aquifers. They don't all happen at the same time. It kind of hops from year to year. So you won't see that, like, you know, for every aquifer it's available in the same year. It doesn't work like that. It's a staggered approach. But through a spatial trend analysis, we can see that the saltwater interface has moved inland. And, you know, if you go to this story map, I don't have it here, but you can also see where we've had to abandon wells before, or we have risks to specific wells because they're so near the saltwater interface. So that's the spatial analysis. For this metric, we also offer a statistical trend analysis, specifically of chloride levels in our well field water supply monitoring program. And so that's where that data that I mentioned about our permitting or our regulatory database comes in. If you go to this map, you can see these like larger circles that have like a dark blue outline, kind of lighter blue inside. These are, out of all of the wells data available, these are the ones that we selected. It's about 100, is it 144? That number might be wrong, but it's over 100 sites that we had to look at. Is it good quality data? Is there sufficient data to conduct a statistical analysis? Is it still currently active? Because we might have, you know, 50 years of data, but if they're no longer reporting and monitoring, then that might be an issue. And so we chose these because of all those factors. And then we, again, conduct the automated trend analysis. I picked this specific photo to the bottom right because what was interesting is we have, if you can see all the red dots, the red dots are essentially the chloride data. On the y-axis, well, actually there's two y-axes here, but on one we have the chloride levels in milligrams per liter. And on the left side, we have water levels in feet and GVD 29. What we have seen in this initial, at this well specifically, there used to be one sampling depth. So within that well, they were sampled in one location. And we see a very clear upward trend of chloride data increasing. Now, what we also see is the dots for the chloride data were initially green. There's like one green dot at the bottom left part of the graph. And so that means that this was basically fresh water. It was less than 100 milligrams per liter. So the concentration of salt was less than 100 milligrams per liter. And immediately we start seeing jumps where it goes to these yellow dots, and that means that it's over 250 to 1,000 milligrams per liter. And it actually skipped, like it went from green to actually the color's orange. It skipped the yellow, which is kind of like, okay, we're increasing, but we're still fresh. And immediately for the rest of time, we have this hypersaline, you know, more than 1,000 milligrams per liter sampling occurring. And so you can see now there's a new, about, what is this year, 2010, there's suddenly this new data set, which is the blue, where you see a new set of data. And that's because they were having so many issues that they had to bring in an additional sampling depth. So now they're collecting at 2 sampling depths. And here we're seeing a downward trend, but still instances on a day-to-day basis where there are fluctuations, where the salinity concentrations, the chloride levels are very high. And so what this means, if I just translate this into like plain English, is we are seeing the salinization of our water supply resources. Of course, this isn't everywhere. This is just one really bad example, but simultaneously a really good example for what we should be on the lookout for and what kind of things to avoid. And so to avoid this, we have things like the minimum flows and water levels that I mentioned earlier, which is where the y-axis on the left side comes in, that looks at our water levels. If we can maintain enough fresh water in the inland part of the system, then hopefully we can fend off that salinization that we're observing. Actually, before I get into this, any questions on this one?
Yeah, I just have one quick question. So has the district already implemented changes in the operational water levels in the canals to address the salinity intrusion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this is not something that we do all at once. This is something that we do in like a staggered approach. So for example, the minimum flows and water levels requirements are revisited every 5 years. And so the answer for certain areas, because we break it up by areas, is yes. And the answers for certain areas is not yet, but we're getting there. But that is something that we're working toward, making sure that we can increase those requirements and those levels, or also bring in other solutions that help to address a lot of this. You know, things like nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, ways of you know, filtering water. Oh, the last thing I did want to share about this specific thing is you can actually see, when you click on those dots, you can actually see a lot of the information about like where this takes place. So this is in North Miami, and this is in the Biscayne Aquifer. And it also shows you like the total area served, what is the depth of the well in any given location, just to give you that like thorough understanding of how this data is collected and what we're talking about. All right, so I'm gonna wrap up this section on looking at historical trends. These are the 2 tools that we have already deployed. We have more coming out. But this is where we first started. Identifying our metrics, that's what we've done first, based on our mission activities. Identifying our metrics, start beginning to quantify and qualify our metrics. And now we move on to going from looking at observations in past data, so measurable observations in historical data available to us, to looking into projections. And so this comes into the second part of the metrics hub that I shared with you, the future outlook in regional resiliency. This is also the third technical memorandum that I was sharing, where we looked at change factors for evaluating flooding conditions for certain events under certain return periods and certain frequencies. And so we look at change factors for depth and duration of rainfall for a certain planning horizon. So here it's 2050 to 2089. This is all modeling based approaches where we look at data from a given subset from the past decades and input a variety of different global models that are then downscaled. I don't do this work. Our statisticians and our contractors do this work. I just kind of help communicate it. I, you know, kind of oversee and coordinate some of it along with the rest of my team and our manager. So this becomes relevant when we conduct our evaluations, because, you know, a lot of times people are like, well, what's a change factor? And the way that I look at it, I can, you know, we can talk about like the more complicated definition, but really what it is, it's the extent or the percentage to which your rainfall is going to change during an event of a certain frequency and a certain duration. So we can look at a 25-year return period, 3-day event, for example. But these change factors, what they tell us for the different return periods is, and this is actually, this one's for a 50-year, is that 1.08, what that basically means is 1.08%, so 8% increase in rainfall. When we look at a 200-year, the 1.23, that means we're looking at a 23%. So it's like 123%. So what we currently have in rainfall plus a certain amount for the future. And all of these are inputted into models, compound flood models, where we can observe and visualize the extent of overland flooding in any given basin. This specific one is the C8 basin, so this is in northern Miami-Dade County. This structure here is the S28 structure, and we can see exactly where our flooding will be exacerbated for any kind of event. This one is maximum overland water depth difference for 100-year event under sea level rise 3. What that means, the district doesn't necessarily, it's similar to the NOAA like intermediate, low, and high sea level rise projections, but sea level rise 3 means today's current sea level plus 3 feet. That compounded with a 100-year event rainfall event. And so this is what that might look like. So we use these modeling efforts to really inform our planning for how we enhance our infrastructure and how we upgrade our infrastructure. This doesn't just mean hardening gray infrastructure. In this specific basin, we're bringing in a set of solutions. We're bringing in nature-based solutions where we're finding, natural areas where you can store water, have rain gardens, and then also, yes, enhance the current gray infrastructure, because it is clear that the path to any of these, to alleviating any of these stresses on our system has to be multifaceted. It won't just be completely engineered, but we can't also just fully rely on a natural system because of all the stressors that we have put on it. Do you have any questions? Okay, part of what we also do with these hydrologic models is, I showed you a little bit of the event scenario. That's where we formulate, well, what'll be the extent of flooding that will be observed in a basin. But then we also, this is actually what one of our technical leads is doing. She's working on, well, how do we estimate the monetary impact that this will have? FEMA does similar work to this. We also look at what they have here as hazard exposure, like where are these areas? And so just in order to quantify the economic risk to our environment, and this all kind of goes into what we end up looking at as like a cost benefit analysis, or also, what we also want to implement are what we call like no regret strategies where we know we will alleviate a lot of the issues in the system. So I'm going to quickly touch on this because I just realized what time it is and I want to give everyone time to just kind of discuss and have questions. But the way that we do this in the district is we have a program in place. It's called the Flood Protection Level of Service Program. And what that essentially means is all of our infrastructure was designed to deliver a certain level of service, or it's all designed to a certain capacity that it can perform in. So what we do through the flood protection level of system is we evaluate exactly how the system is performing. We go basin by basin, and then we've also prioritized where we're seeing the worst and where we know we need to go next after that. And so that looks at a few different performance metrics. I won't really go into that. They're listed on the screen here. I can also share links to all of this so you all can read a little bit more about it. But this is what really supports like our decision making and how we kind of advance our strategies and prioritize our investments for how we will do a few things, including adaptation, so how we adapt to a changing climate, and mitigation, how we kind of offset for the impacts that we are expecting. So the FPLOS program, the one I was talking about, the Flood Protection Level of Service program, it is in phases. I just wanted to share this to kind of describe like how we go through this, but I'll quickly kind of share with you the phases. The first phase is what we call the assessment phase. This is where we just do a basic assessment, vulnerability assessments to understand where are the most kind of vulnerable areas in the region, where are the most at-risk infrastructure in the region. Then we have a phase 2. This is where we start to talk about, we look for solutions. And this involves a lot of external and internal coordination because, as I shared earlier, we have a primary system and then the secondary and tertiary system. So part A of phase 2 is really to look at our own infrastructure and try to find solutions for adaptation and mitigation. But part 2 of that, or B, is working with our stakeholders to help kind of align, because if a neighborhood is increasing, Miami-Dade County increases a canal bank for one of their canals, but that water flows into our system, and if we don't have the capacity, then what is really being achieved at a regional level? So that's where we kind of coordinate all of this. And then the third phase is what we call the implementation phase. That's where, okay, we've done our assessments, we've identified our areas of vulnerability, we've gone through some planning charrettes and work groups to really identify what projects we can make sure are all aligning to increase resiliency in the region. And there we begin to implement it through, the permitting, the planning, the design, the construction. By the time we've got into phase 3, we actually have at least a 30% design for many of our projects. Some of these, I talked about this a little bit. I'm glad that I brought this slide. I forgot it was here, but I said, our approaches are not just hardening our gray infrastructure. We also make improvements to the infrastructure itself, the gates, for example. Some of them are old. We put in pumps in areas where gravity structures are not going to be enough. Increasing storage, improvements to the canal banks. People have brought up deep injection wells. That's absolutely things we're looking at. We don't have this here, but nature-based solutions, having nearby rain gardens, expanding the banks to having maybe some level of living kind of natural systems that help to attenuate, for example, nutrients on the way out before it goes to the bay and causes eutrophication, and a whole bunch of other things that we are implementing. So as you can see from kind of everything that I've shared, and I think the last bit has been focused on flood protection, but we have a lot of challenges. And really what our goal is to find the opportunities and the solutions that make and promotes a multifaceted approach to mitigating and adapting. So I talked a lot. How do we apply all of this information? In resiliency right now, I'm sure everyone's heard that's kind of a buzzword. We have a lot of money coming down from the federal and state systems, but also we have a lot of capital improvement projects that we want to bring in. So what we do is we look for resources through partnerships with our local and state agencies, and we identify projects for resiliency, and we apply for grants to really get resources to fund those projects. And then we have, which we just submitted yesterday to DEP, our flood resiliency plan. And this is where we really rank our projects, where we go into detail about the design, the strategies. And these projects include everything from a vulnerability assessment to a pilot study to our more construction-oriented projects. But together, all of the things that I just described of looking at historical data, looking at future projections, considering and evaluating the state of our system, all feeds into this one plan to kind of inform what our next steps are. And in the entirety of this process, we engage with all of our partner agencies and stakeholders to enhance the viability of all of our resiliency projects. So what are our next steps? Our next steps are to continue to work on the metrics work that I do, which is the automation to understand the trends that we're seeing. I didn't share this when I was showing you those trends, but with doing that, we're able to identify a shift. As we bring in more annual data and we know the data from the previous years, we can see, oh, like that trend is changing after we, increased this flow, or after we got this rainfall, or what have you. So we're bringing that we're automating 5 more of our metrics, evapotranspiration region-wide and water quality. I'm excited for that one because initially we only looked at Lake Okeechobee, but we'll be identifying sentinel stations throughout the region where we are looking at water quality automatically being updated in real time. We continue to track and document and communicate everything that we're observing, any shifts that we observe in this climate data. We continue to work toward future projections, specifically rainfall, which is something we're doing at the state level and with other water management districts. It is super clear for us that global models, however downscaled, might not always be enough when we want to quantify what rainfall is going to look like in the future. Florida is very unique. There's a lot of local factors that play a big role in how our climate is showing up. And then we continue to coordinate with local agencies, state agencies, and our federal partners to support resiliency planning at a regional level. So not just what we're doing, but making sure that what they're doing, what we're doing, all aligns. So for example, we're starting the flood resiliency, the 216 study with the Army Corps, and that's coming up, and that's where we look at the CNF system in its entirety to understand where our vulnerabilities lie and where we can align different activities to ensure resiliency. And then I just want to go into, before I, our time's almost up, but before I turn it over to questions or discussion, I do want to make super clear that, all of this work is, I have some names up here, but all of this is really made possible by that empirical knowledge that I mentioned, that guidance, that support, that scientific input that we receive from not just our technical leads and subject matter experts, but our support branches from GIS to IT to data management. Our lessons learned have been there's always room for improvement, and collaboration is key. As we dig into things, we can see where, we can make this better. We've updated SOPs within the district. We've created new QA/QC processes for certain data, because the way we look at it in resiliency is a little bit different than how maybe someone just doing annual reporting might look at it. And of course, it takes a village and a team. And so this is just some of our staff who was at the Water Institute Symposium earlier this year, sharing everything from how we quantify, our metrics, to how we monitor sea levels, how we manage data, how we monitor flood protection and our infrastructure. And then to the left is my team. It wouldn't be possible without any of them. If you want to hear more about what we're doing, Dr. Chin has my email. I'm happy to share any resources, and you can also sign up for our newsletter. It's not a full-on newsletter yet. It's updates and reminders about events that we have coming up, which in September we have 3. We have a resiliency forum kicking off. And that's my presentation. So thank you very much for the engagement. And I have a few more minutes if anybody does have questions and wants to stay on.